Have you ever shared something with somebody or took a risk in some way, and afterward, no matter how it turned out, found yourself feeling really exhausted or really overwhelmed with feeling, or maybe even completely numb and not able to feel anything? Well, if so, you're not alone, and you've probably heard it referred to as a vulnerability hangover. I think Brene Brown is the one that came up with that. It's a very real thing, and if you've ever experienced that, then today's video is for you. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about kind of what happens, what creates that feeling afterward, and the reality that vulnerability, what it is and why we need it, and then some things that maybe can be helpful, something really significant that can be helpful in kind of dealing with that so-called hangover. So, as I said, Brene Brown refers to it as a vulnerability hangover. Anytime that you've shared yourself, been open with somebody that you might find really struggling afterward. And I think this is something that is real for people kind of across the board, regardless of history. I think when it comes to people that have experienced childhood trauma or ongoing interpersonal trauma, that is true. I think that you could still certainly refer to it as a vulnerability hangover. But what's, I think, important to recognize with this population is that a big part of that vulnerability hangover is actually very much connected to shame. And it's shame that you've been carrying around basically your entire life. Shame that you may not even recognize is there. So I tend to refer to it as just kind of a connection to shame or a shame attack. It's a rise in the shame in being vulnerable. So what is happening that creates that? So when you have allowed yourself to be open, to share something that you're feeling, that you're thinking, or part of your personal experience, it is incredibly vulnerable, especially if it's something that you've held as a secret. For whatever reason, you've held it as a secret. When you share that with somebody, fear comes in. You may not notice it as fear, but fear often shows up because when you're vulnerable and sharing something, shame is right there. Because whether you have felt shame about what it is that you're sharing, whether you think that what you're sharing makes you somehow unworthy or undeserving, because shame is attached to that, something from a long time ago or something from yesterday. Because the thing about shame, and I've talked about this before, the thing about shame, anytime it is there, it's connected to all the shame that we feel. Shame doesn't have, we don't experience shame in segments. We don't think about this one thing that we feel shame around and then only experience the felt sense of shame around that. When we feel shame, just like when we feel grief, we're feeling it for all the shame that we feel. So not only is it just the risk that you take in being vulnerable, which is kind of unsettling enough sometimes, but it often brings up shame. And again, you may not be aware that it's connecting to shame. You may not be aware that you have any shame. And this is something that has happened a lot with the people that I've worked with over the years, where they will believe that they don't feel shame about something. Like, for example, no, I don't have shame about what happened to me because I know it wasn't my fault. Like, there are a lot of people who will be able to say that and truly think that. But then when we start getting into it a little bit more, recognizing that there are little ways that they do actually feel responsible for what happened in some way or another. And sometimes they're not conscious of this. And, well, often they're not conscious of it. And remember that the things that we're not conscious of have more of an impact. Because when we're not conscious of it, we can't fight it. We can't heal it. We can't do reality testing around it. So when that shame comes up, no matter what it looks like, no matter what it's about, whether you're conscious of it or not, when that shame comes up, it doesn't feel good. Shame is one of the most destructive emotions that we experience because of its profound impact on what we believe about who we are. So when you've shared something and it feels vulnerable to share it, there's often shame that is right there at the surface, and sometimes it's way beyond the surface, and sometimes it's just like right underneath the surface. So you may not necessarily feel bad, but you might feel drained. You might feel easily anxious, or find yourself worrying more easily, or more fearful about what people are thinking. So again, you may not feel shame necessarily, but some of those things are going to be present. And that is because often shame is a part of that. And the reality is that vulnerability is a part of life. Emotional vulnerability in particular, and as a child, physically, we're incredibly vulnerable. And as a woman, we are more physically vulnerable much of the time, depending on who we're around, I suppose. And so vulnerability can look a lot of different ways. It is a natural part of life. Vulnerability itself is not a bad thing. It is part of what creates so much struggle for many of us. Anybody watching this video probably. It creates a lot of struggle because we feel unsettled, we feel uncertain, we fear bad things happening, we fear being judged, not being believed, we fear trust, in people. So there are a lot of things that we're fearful of. And anytime we're afraid of something and we're faced with that situation, it creates vulnerability. So a huge part of our struggle. However, vulnerability is also a really significant part of what it takes to heal. And you might think, how does this thing that creates so much struggle for me, how does that actually have a part in healing? And it makes sense, right? Like, it makes sense that you would question that. So here's the thing. And when I talk about this with people, especially if it's a one-on-one conversation, it's hard to understand. And there's often a lot of resistance to it. But so much of the struggle that we have, so much of the impact of what it means to be a survivor of childhood trauma is that we isolate. We believe that we're different than other people. We hold on to that shame and believe that that shame is the truth of who we are, which is not true, but particularly when we don't share it, we're allowed to continue to believe it. So part of healing, and in my course Journey to Wholeness, there's actually a section where I kind of cover some of this. But I'm often met with resistance in some way because vulnerability kind of goes along with the idea of weakness, of being unsafe. And just like when you're sharing something with somebody, and it doesn't even have to be something like trauma, it can be opening yourself up to a new friendship, going after a job that you want, telling somebody that you love them for the first time. There are a lot of ways that we can experience vulnerability that are normal, healthy things, but it still can create vulnerability. So part of healing, really a big part of healing, is allowing yourself to be vulnerable in connecting within yourself, acknowledging how you feel, acknowledging the truth of your experience, allowing yourself to do the deep work of healing. All of that creates vulnerability, and all of that is a necessary part of healing. Other aspects of that for healing are connection, and I've talked about that a lot. Healing happens in connection, and the only way that we can experience true connection is by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable in order to connect in an authentic and genuine and deep way. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to share everything, share all your deepest, darkest stuff. It doesn't mean that you have to be the first one to tell somebody that you love them. It means creating opportunities for yourself to be honest with yourself. Like I said, accepting or acknowledging the truth of your experience, being able to acknowledge when you're feeling something that you think you shouldn't feel. There are so many examples. So it's vulnerability just in connecting with yourself. And then there is vulnerability in connecting with others. And part of the reason why a therapeutic relationship has such healing power in it is because in order for that person to help you, in order to build a therapeutic relationship, you have to be pretty open and honest with that therapist, right? Your therapist may be the only person that you're sharing certain things with. Maybe you've never shared something before, but you're sharing it with your therapist. Maybe you've been terrified to share it, and maybe it takes you a year to share it with your therapist. But in the therapeutic relationship, you're sharing things that are feeling vulnerable, right? There's this, and how you feel it specifically might be a little bit different, but there's anxiety or maybe a flatness even. In order for you to do it, you have to be completely numbed to feeling anything. Or you might feel so anxious you feel like you're going to throw up. You might feel a lot of tension. You might feel just really scared. There are a lot of ways it can show up, but that is the vulnerability. And when you share, then you are in a vulnerable state because you aren't sure. You don't know what the outcome of sharing that is going to be. Will you be judged? Will you be looked at differently? These are a couple of big ones that tend to come up. Is your therapist potentially going to not want to work with you anymore? I've heard that one many times. Is your therapist maybe going to think, these are all things I've heard from clients, is your therapist going to think that you have too many issues and isn't going to be able to help you because there's no help, there's no hope available to you? I've heard all of those things by more than one person. So there's a lot of vulnerability that goes into that. And whether it's a therapist or a friend, a partner, or a family member, especially if you're relatively new to sharing things, it's incredibly vulnerable. Incredibly vulnerable. But the only way that you can feel connected is to allow yourself to be seen. The only way that you can release the shame that you've been holding on to is by sharing it. It's important who you share it with, and that's a whole other video, and I have talked about that before. But the only way we can really be connected to somebody on a deep level, so not just surface acquaintance, talking about the good stuff, high vibe only sort of thing. I'm talking about true, deep, genuine, and authentic connection. Because that's where the healing happens. When we allow ourselves to be seen and have the experience of not being judged, of being accepted or supported, whatever it is, whatever the experience, healthy experience, appropriate experience on the other side of that is, that itself is healing. Healing happens in that moment. Even if you feel nauseous, even if you feel like you're about to throw up, as long as the response is appropriate and you are able to take that in on some level. You might have to revisit it later because right now you're caught up in all that emotion and all that unease. But there is healing that happens that moves you up the mountain, no matter how you feel in the moment. And regarding the vulnerability hangover, or the residual shame that is very present, kind of like simmering. If you think about water simmering, it's like this constant shame is just right there. That is happening because the shame is there. So that feeling afterward, whether it's exhaustion, whether it's fear, like, oh my God, what have I done? What if this happens, or what if that happens? That's unfortunately a pretty normal thing that people experience. But that is part of the process, because when you first start sharing, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You've made up your mind that doing anything like that is going to result in something really bad happening, right? Throughout your life, you've told yourself, maybe not consciously aware that you've told yourself this, but you've told yourself, if I told anybody this, they wouldn't believe me. If anybody knew this, they would think I'm a terrible person. If I tried that and it didn't work out, then I really am a failure, right? You've had these thoughts throughout your life, and so you've believed them. You've absolutely believed them at your core. So when you do something different, when you risk being vulnerable in one of those ways that we've talked about, then you're not sure what the outcome is going to be yet, right? Even if it went really well and you were supported and maybe even were able to feel kind of good about the reaction, you're still thinking about, okay, well, maybe they'll feel differently tomorrow. Or maybe like you try for a new job and maybe you get hired, but then you're just kind of waiting around for them to see that they made a mistake, right? I know if you're watching this that you can relate to some sort of experience that is somewhat similar. Maybe different specifics, but the idea, right? That even 2 weeks down the road or 2 years down the road in a job that you really wanted, you might still worry that someday they're going to figure it out. That is part of that vulnerability, because you don't yet trust that you are qualified. You don't yet trust that you are worthy. You don't yet trust that somebody could see you as being a really valuable member of the team. And so when you're feeling vulnerable, or when you're feeling stressed out about work or something like that, those ideas are going to come to mind. So that's kind of what's happening in the repercussions of being vulnerable. But again, we need to do that. We need to have those kinds of experience so that we can kind of retrain our thinking and our physiological response, the nervous system response. We need to have those experiences so that we have concrete proof that can show us that it can be different, that it is in fact different. Now, I want to be clear, sometimes you risk being vulnerable and it doesn't work out. You might share something with somebody, like an abuse history, and they may look at you like they're confused and say, well, why didn't you tell? Well, that certainly doesn't feel supportive, does it? And some of you I know have had that experience. And they may not even mean it in a way that is malicious or blaming, but that's what it is, right? And so when you have those types of experiences, it can kind of set you back a little bit, because there's now proof that it's not safe, that you will be blamed. And that's incredibly unfortunate. And as a therapist and now a mentor, that is something that I have had to really spend quite a bit of time talking people through and really continuing to work on to help them move past that. But the reality is there are so many people in all of our communities, no matter where we are, who just don't get it. And that is the kind of response, and much worse for sure. So that's kind of what's happening. But the vulnerability is a part of the healing that we need to experience in order to get up that mountain. So what do you do when you have been vulnerable in some way? And again, it doesn't have to be big. In fact, if you've got a lot of stress going on in your life, just something that seems very small in terms of vulnerability will feel much bigger, because stress creates vulnerability. Even good stress creates vulnerability. And the more things you have to feel vulnerable about, even if it's good stress, that vulnerability is compounded. So it's not just, oh, I'm a little vulnerable here, I'm a little vulnerable here, and I'm a little vulnerable here. If you've got different areas where you're feeling vulnerable or stressed, the vulnerability becomes much bigger, and everything can have like a more significant impact on you. So this is going to seem incredibly counterintuitive, and you might be even thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's crazy, and no, I'm not going to do that. So one of the most important things when you are feeling some of that vulnerability hangover, well, first, it's important to recognize, and I have talked about this before, that when you're feeling that, your inclination is generally going to be to pull away. Pull away from that person for sure, but often, much of the time, pulling away from people in general because you don't feel safe. That's going to be the natural inclination. It may not be a conscious thought process that you go through. You just may find, maybe even a couple of days later or a couple of weeks later, you may find that you have pulled away from people or that person. You're avoiding people in general or that person. And this is why it's so important to be able to check in with yourself on a regular basis and notice what's present. And I've talked about that a lot, right? Because it's not something that's really obvious, especially if that's kind of a natural way for you to be in the world, where you tend to isolate. So we have that desire to pull back because it feels safer. But in reality, when we do that, it reinforces the shame. It reinforces that there's something wrong with us, that we're not worthy of that connection, that we're not worthy of being supported. And again, this isn't necessarily anything happening on a conscious level. You're not necessarily sitting around thinking all of that through. You might be, especially if you've been doing the work for a while, you may be more aware of some of those thoughts. But for many people, you're not aware that that's actually happening. You're just feeling even more vulnerable, more sure that it was a bad idea and that you can't trust anybody and that you're a horrible person, and that's why this person is judging you, even if they're not judging you. But because of that vulnerability, it's easy to perceive that that is in fact what's happening. So, because pulling back, withdrawing, isolating makes it even worse, then what is helpful is connection. And I know it doesn't seem to make sense. And how, when you're struggling like that, like how can you put yourself out there and connect? Well, it's not easy. And this is part of why healing is such a challenging process and why there are so many layers to healing. Because it isn't going to come natural. There's a good chance that everything within you is going to be saying, no, that's dangerous, don't do that. Are you stupid? Why would you put yourself in that situation again? Everything in you, like the energy within you, is going to be trying to pull you back to keep you from trying to do that. But the reason that we're struggling in this way over here is because when we isolate, we see it, we experience it as this is the only way to be safe. This is what I'm meant for. I'm not worthy of support. I'm not worthy of connection. And again, when you're not conscious of those types of thoughts, it has even more impact because you don't have the ability to counter it. So it affirms those ideas that you've held on to without you having to do anything or be conscious of any thoughts. That is what is happening. So the way that you move out of that is by connecting. And maybe it's not the person that you shared with, especially if that person responded in an inappropriate way, like an objectively inappropriate way, then that's not the person you want to connect with. And I say objectively based on my last video. So if you haven't seen that, you can take a look at that. But if that person actually did respond in an appropriate way, was supportive of whatever it was, maybe even found that you have a point of connection in regard to having similar types of experiences, then re-engaging with that person in some way, you don't have to talk about the thing that you shared, but re-engaging with that person in some way can actually be really helpful. Or you can connect with somebody else. And you don't have to talk about necessarily what you're struggling with. You can, and ideally maybe you might, but it doesn't have to be. It's just about re-engaging. That's it. It's just about re-engaging, ideally in a way where you can show up authentically. Again, it doesn't mean you have to share vulnerable things. It doesn't mean you have to talk about what you're struggling with, but it's just showing up in a way where you feel like you can be yourself. So whether it's somebody else or the other person that the situation left you feeling vulnerable from, when you re-engage, you are affirming that you are worthy of that engagement. And notice that I said, if you can show up in a way that is just you showing up as yourself, right? That's important because if you put on that mask and try to be somebody that you're not, then there's no real connection there because they're not seeing the real you. So then you can say that, well, if they had really known how I felt or what I thought, then they wouldn't have wanted to talk to me, right? So that can actually be counterproductive. But it could be like literally somebody that you're just going to go hang out, go to a movie and hang out together. So there's not even a lot of conversation happening, but you're still engaging. You're still in the proximity of another human. And even if it's virtual, even if it's talking on the phone, so it doesn't have to be in person, but it's engaging with somebody. So when you find that point of connection with somebody, and again, please keep this in mind, you don't have to be talking about the thing you're struggling with in order for it to be helpful. But you do have to feel like the way that you're showing up is genuine. Even if you're struggling in part, but you can be present and enjoy this thing that you're doing, or you can be engaged in this thing that you're doing. That is showing up in a genuine and authentic way, because we don't have to tell everybody that we come across everything that's going on with us, right, in order for us to be authentic. It just means that we're not trying to hide something so that we can be accepted. And there's a difference between trying to hide it and leaving it to come back to later. So I know that might be a little bit confusing, and if you've got questions about that, feel free to share, but that there's a difference there. So when we re-engage with the world in some way, it helps us see that two things. One, that we are worthy of that we are deserving of being around people or engaging with people. And it gives our mind a bit of a distraction, and a type of distraction that can help shift how we feel. So I know I kind of covered a lot of different things, and I literally could go into depth about probably all of them. way more than I did. But I hope that that gives you a better sense of understanding what's happening and why, what might be happening inside of you without your awareness, and then why it's important to be able to be consciously choosing to do something a little bit different. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it too. I would love to hear from you in the comments, your thoughts, reactions, your experience. And again, if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the bell for notifications. Thanks so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time.